Hello everybody and welcome to my first scary story Stitch With Me. I brought out my Halloween Disney shirt for the occasion. One of my Disney Halloween shirts. And today's story is going to be coming from the Haunted America book, which is real stories from across America. The back basically says, Haunted America takes you on a grand tour of ghostly hauntings through the US and Canada, sweeping from terrifying battlefield specters at Little Bighorn to a vaudeville palace in Tampa, from ghostly apparitions in President Garfield's home in Ohio to the White House in Washington, D.C. So, because I live in California, we might be having a visitor. Come on. So because I live in California, I am going to be reading All Ghosts on Deck. Some states have more than one story, but this one is kind of a long one, so I hope it fits in the time that we have, because it is, I already did the Stitch With Me part, which is about an hour, so. This one is about 10 pages, so we'll see if it fits. So this one is called All Ghosts on Deck, and it is about the Queen Mary. I read these books a long time ago. One of them is on, there's 3 books in the series that I know of. One of them I have on loan to one of my old teachers, or my old receptionist actually. So I haven't read these in probably like 15 years, so I don't remember what they're about, or like, I don't really remember the stories. So, anyway. October 1942. The Cunard White Star Line's majestic flagship, the HMS Queen Mary, has been re-outfitted and pressed into service, ferrying American troops to European battlefields. At 1,019 feet and 81,237 gross tons, the Queen Mary had the best time for crossing the Atlantic. Speed is critical on the ship's unescorted wartime dashes across the Atlantic, between New York City and Britain. Nearly 15,000 soldiers are crowded into cramped quarters as the Queen Mary steams off the coast of Ireland, only a few hundred miles from her destination of Clyde. She has picked up a British convoy to protect the valuable cargo of men and materials in the German U-boat-infested waters near Ireland. The Allied command remembers all too vividly the 1915 sinking of the Lithuania by a German U-20 in the Irish Sea, and doesn't want a similar tragedy. And so it was that the several British soldiers patrolled the waters well ahead of the Queen Mary, while one anti-aircraft cruiser, the 4,200-ton Curacoa, kept a close vigil off the Queen's bow. The procedure for guarding the Queen called for the Curacoa to zigzag ahead, alternating positions from port to starboard, watching for enemy submarines that might try to slip through the forward armada. Somehow a mistake was made. Suddenly, in broad daylight, the Curacoa cut across the Queen's bow too late for the monster of the sea to slow or alter course. The Curacoa was sliced in half. The Queen Mary was relatively unscathed, although a tear in her bow allowed some water to enter a forward compartment. Watertight bulkheads prevented serious damage or possible sinking. The Curacoa went under in less than 5 minutes, carrying 338 sailors to their deaths. Only 101 survived. Many of the deaths were from drowning, since wartime restrictions prevented the Queen Mary from stopping to pick up survivors. The stopped ship the size of the Queen presented an easy target to enemy submarines. A naval inquiry some months later found that the Curacoa 2/3 to blame and the Queen Mary 1/3 responsible for the tragedy. Really? There the matter would have ended, an exceedingly sad chapter in the Queen Mary's illustrious transoceanic career, if not for a peculiar twist of fate that brought the Queen to Long Beach, California in 1967. She was to be made over into a permanently anchored floating hotel and resort along the city's burgeoning oceanfront. On board the ship's voyage to retirement was one John Smith, a tall, soft-spoken sailor with sharp features and the ruddy complexion of a man at home on the sea. Now retired as the Queen's last chief engineer, Smith stayed aboard while the ship was being outfitted as a tourist attraction. But what John Smith remembers most about his job on the Queen is not the ocean voyage around Cape Horn to Long Beach, for the trip went smoothly enough, nor the months of tedious watch as the grand old lady of the sea was stripped of her engines and made ready for paying customers. He knew that the Queen Mary was a relic of an earlier age, unable to compete with luxurious passenger jets. What was a top speed of 30 knots, after all, when travelers could reach Europe in a matter of hours, not days? What bothered John Smith the most then, and does to this day, were the unexplained sounds and phantom voices he heard on the ship, all originating near the bow of the Queen Mary, in almost the precise location where the Corocoa had punched a hole in her iron skin nearly 4 decades earlier. Smith is precise in his memories. The Queen Mary has a short bow, 8 decks high, and a division a short ways after the bow, about 8 feet, but it's only a partial division, Smith said, sitting in an elegant conference room and the sitting in the elegant conference room aboard the refurbished Queen. Then there's a full division about 30 feet back. At the bow, there are 6 decks of vertical stairs with very dim lighting that go down near the bottom of the ship. It's the structural area, so they can't store anything. Too many girders and beams on the way. On the last voyage, I still didn't know much about the history of the ship, not even everything the general public knew. One of my jobs was to keep the ship from sinking. I'd roam the deck with the flashlight, and at times I'd go up on the top deck at the bow and look down at the 6-deck vertical ladder. I was looking down to make sure that there was a way to get down with ropes, Smith noted, adding that his regular patrols continued for several months after the Queen reached her berth in Long Beach. When he reached the bow, Smith would sometimes hear water rushing, as if pipes were breaking or the hull had sprung a leak. Smith would descend the ladder in the forward section of the ship, but the gurgling and rushing sound would gradually fade away. I would be really mystified and wonder what I heard and where it had come from. Nothing was ever wrong, there were no problems, Smith said. And then I would hear a strange tapping noise. Now, the ship was tied up at the pier near the naval base, so there was no reason for this, he said. At sea, Smith realized the noises he heard would have been too quiet to have been audible above the pounding of the waves. I definitely heard it. I checked the ship, I looked over the sides, there was no one around and no activities going on. I can't explain it. The most unnerving experience for John Smith, however, came on the heels of that rhythmic tapping and the seeming rushing of water. Voices. Voices as if from a distance. Smith could hear them crying, moaning, shrieking, even laughing sometimes. Always men's voices. When that phenomenon occurred, Smith left as quickly as possible. I know that common sense says that something structural or mechanical was causing it, but it happened again and again, probably 7 or 8 times. It was after he retired that John Smith read a history of the Queen Mary, including an account of the grisly collision with the cruiser Corocoa. Although part of the Queen's bow was torn open, the ship was able to continue on to Scotland for temporary repairs. It was eventually returned to Boston and dry docked, while the bow was permanently repaired before the Queen returned to service. If I had known about that, I'd say it all ties in, but I didn't know about the collision until years later, Smith acknowledges. He often felt, as well as heard something during his watches. You'd hear the thump, then the vibration, the water gurgling, and then the crying and shrieking, Smith said. I felt vibrations like going over a washboard, but it was always more or less in that pattern. The thumping noise always first, never clear, it seemed garbled. When one sound faded out, then another faded in. Maybe the whole thing took 60 seconds at most. From his research, Smith knows that the mysterious voices came from the same area of the Queen Mary that would have struck the Corocoa. He believes that what he heard on all those occasions was the ghostly, albeit invisible, reenactment of the tragic disaster. John Smith also encountered the ghost of British statesman Winston Churchill on the Queen Mary, or at least the remnants of smoke from Sir Winston's famous cigars. During World War I, while the Queen usually carried American and Allied forces to Europe, a special stateroom was outfitted for the wartime British Prime Minister for his frequent trips to Washington, D.C. Sir Winston preferred to travel by ship rather than by air. A quarter of a century later, the Prime Minister's old stateroom, M115, was given over as a temporary office for Smith during the Queen's renovation in Long Beach. I definitely smelled smoke in that room, cigar smoke, Smith recalls. He had a favorite brand of Cuban cigars that they even used to sell at the coffee shop on board. They probably even called them Winston Churchill cigars. Nothing smelled quite like it, but there it was. I recognized it. Right now, 20 years later, I would recognize that smell almost more than any other. The odor was most prevalent after hours when everyone except Smith and a few others had left the ship. I could see the smoke near the ceiling. The ventilators were not operating then, so there were no artificial ventilation. It all came through the porthole or a door if it was open. And if the door was closed at night and the porthole was shut, somehow the smoke got in there. The smoke didn't last. It would gradually disappear, along with the cigar odor, in about 10 minutes, Smith said. There was no apparent pattern. It happened often, but not every evening. Maybe 3 or 4 days in a row, nothing, then it would come again. As soon as I smelled it, I would go out in the corridor and look around in each direction. I assumed that somebody maybe even blew smoke through the keyhole, but it wasn't that. As far as Smith could tell, no workman renovating the ship smoked cigars while aboard, and certainly not the distinctive brand Sir Winston preferred. The screams of dying sailors and the sight and smell of cigar smoke aren't the only peculiar remembrances of retired Chief Engineer John Smith. One of the most well-known ghost legends on the old ship concerns not people, but a handsome Irish setter dog, whose barking echoes even to this day. John Smith knows the story well. The kennel was up on the sun deck. Unless you were a VIP like Elizabeth Taylor, she could keep her dogs in her stateroom. You would have to put your dog in the kennel during the trip. An old English gentleman always traveled with his beautiful Irish setter. Real friendly he was. He'd wag his tail when strangers came up. The dog would walk every day by his master up and down the deck. They had a regular walkway there. He didn't even need a leash. The dog would just follow and stay right with him. One night, this dog started howling. The kennel attendant was called by security to see what was wrong. They couldn't control him, and he howled and scratched at the cage, which he had never done before. So the kennelman let him out. He didn't know if the dog had been injured, needed food or water, or what was wrong. The dog kept running around the kennel. It was fenced in, so he couldn't get out, but he was always scratching at the exit gate. Anyway, the kennelman sent the security guard down to wake up the Englishman to bring him up to see what he could do to control the dog. They didn't really want to disturb him at 3 o'clock in the morning, but they had to keep the dog quiet. The security guard found the man dead in his room. John Smith believes the dog somehow sensed his master's death. Shortly after the Queen Mary arrived in Long Beach, Smith heard what he believed was a dog barking on the sun deck. Always, the barking was indistinct, a distant bang that was directionless. It seemed to emanate from the old kennel area, yet when Smith and his colleagues got there, it seemed remote again, almost as if the spectral dog had run to another part of the ship. Nancy Wozni was a guide and a security officer during the Queen Mary's early years as a tourist attraction in Long Beach. Now an investigator for a Southern California insurance company, Wozni speaks of her uncanny experiences on the ship with the assurance of one who is used to dealing with facts and details. While John Smith never saw an apparition, Wozni had an unnerving encounter with an actual ghost. My job as a lead guide was to close up the area after the tour. I'd turn off the tapes or the lights, or reattach the chains, whatever needed to be done. I was pretty sure I was the last one on this particular tour, Wozni said. The tour had taken her to the engine room. She had completed riding up the first escalator to the main deck, and was halfway up a second escalator when it happened. I felt someone behind me. I turned around and saw a man standing behind me. I figured I'd missed somebody, or that he was crew because his overalls were dirty. He had a beard, a beautiful beard, short black hair, very round black eyes, and very white skin, grossly white, and blue overalls. I kept thinking he was maintenance. I thought he came up behind me, and I just must not have heard him, Wozni remembers. The man wore no expression, looked straight ahead as if Wozni didn't exist. That was about 2 seconds from the top, Wozni said, adding that she reached the top and stepped aside to let the man pass. He wasn't there. Now, not a word was exchanged between Wozni and the man. Instead, she turned around because she sensed his presence. I didn't feel him touch me, but I just felt I wasn't alone. He was three-dimensional, very vivid. Could it have been a maintenance man playing a practical joke on the young guide? Something that wasn't all that unusual? No, answers Wozni. There's no place for him to go. He couldn't have reversed himself. It was my job to turn off the escalator. That's why I was doing what I was doing. I was about 3 steps from the top. I turned and saw him. I turned back thinking I had missed somebody, stepped aside to let him go by, and when I looked back, he was gone, Wozni said. There may be a reason for the phantom crewman's visit. According to some sources, a crew member had somehow been crushed in one of the watertight doors during the ship's heyday. His name was John Peter, although the spelling of the last name may have been different. Wozni thinks the man on the escalator could very well have been Peter. On modern cruise ships, swimming pools are built on open decks to take full advantage of the sun. Passengers can while away their afternoons sitting in deck chairs only a few feet away from the soothing waters of a freshwater pool. The Queen Mary too has a swimming pool, but it is as different from those found on today's ships as the opulent mahogany and brass staterooms on the Queen are from the relatively Spartan cabins on ships that cater to tourists on a budget. The Queen's swimming pool is quite small, but installed in an area the size of a gymnasium, deep within the bowels of the ship. There was little reason to build a swimming pool on an open deck for a vessel plying the North Atlantic. The pool is kept half filled with water to prevent cracks and to show modern visitors what passengers in the 1930s considered a luxurious touch. Soft, indirect lighting casts subtle shadows on the Art Deco designs, lending an altogether ethereal feel to the area. 2 stairways lead down to the pool deck from a spacious entryway. Sturdy columns surround the pool, rising dozens of feet to the ceiling above. Even a diving board stands unattended at the pool's deep end. But all is not quiet here. Several current and former employees say that a woman swims in the pool, a bather who could very well be a ghost. The former guide and security officer, Nancy Wozni, is one who has seen the ghostly bather. It was almost like I had caught her in another dimension, Wozni explained. I couldn't see her face, but I saw her form. I saw the bathing suit. But everything was absolutely void of color. She wasn't transparent, though she didn't appear before my eyes, and she didn't disappear before my eyes. Wozni was near the railing at the entrance, gazing down at the pool when she saw the woman. I thought she had stepped back behind the pillar. I disconnected the rope blocking the stairs very quickly and ran down because I thought it was a tourist. The startled young guide quickly looked behind the column, only to be dumbfounded by finding absolutely no one. She noted that the other doors leading into the pool area were closed, with no other way for the intruder to have escaped. Lester Hart is a laconic, plain-spoken man who works as an engineer on the Queen Mary. He too had seen a mysterious woman in the swimming pool area, but his report of what happened to him in 1983 is quite different from that of Nancy Wozni. I walked into the starboard right side of the pool, and she was on the port side and just disappeared, Hart said. From what I could tell, she was 35 to 40 years old and blonde. She was in a white flowing gown, like a nightgown, or maybe an evening dress with long sleeves. She was standing by the double doors, and it was as if she turned around and vanished. The doors, Hart describes, lead from the pool to an area of the ship known as Shaft Alley, named after the giant shafts that ran from the 4 single reduction geared turbines, each producing 160,000 horsepower, to the immense 18-foot propellers. Shaft Alley has had its share of mysterious events. She looked straight at me, Hart said of the woman near the doors. I looked at her and then she turned away. She was right at the corner of the door, a hazy image. It wasn't a person. It startled me. You hear about these things, but you never expect to see them. Hart had been working the graveyard shift when he saw the apparition at about 3 o'clock in the morning, but dismisses the notion that his mind was playing tricks on him. A second incident in the pool area provided Hart with the additional visible evidence of a ghostly presence. He had been working in one of the Queen's maintenance shops, a dozen yards down a corridor from the swimming pool. I came out of the shop and it sounded like somebody was swimming in the pool. I walked up there and there was nobody around. The water was moving, and on the port side, where the ladder comes out of the pool, there were wet footprints going down through the double doors that go up to sea deck, and they stopped. Well, I turned around and started up to the next deck, and there's wet footprints going up the steps. They vanished too. More puzzled than frightened by the singular indication that someone had taken an unauthorized dip in the pool, Hart tried to find some rational explanation. If somebody was playing games, they weren't going to stand there and get dried off and change clothes. If they're soaking wet, the water's going to be there. But the footprints just stopped. It was just like when you get out of the swimming pool. It's not unusual for overnight guests in the hotel section of the ship to slip into the pool area for a swim, but not this time. Hart said it took him less than a minute to walk from the shop to the pool, making it impossible, he believes, for two people, there were two sets of footprints, to exit the water and run off. Two other factors make a human explanation questionable. The incident occurred between 2 and 4 o'clock in the morning, certainly very late for anyone to be roaming the ship. Also, an alarm system, installed to prevent unauthorized persons from entering certain sections of the ship at night, would have been triggered if someone had left the pool to go topside. Hart himself tripped the alarm during his search for the mysterious intruders. According to Richard Curlin, a spokesman for the Queen Mary, a woman passenger drowned in the pool during the 1960s. Who she was and under what circumstances she died are not known, but the fact alone makes the sightings of a ghostly bather even more plausible. Tough, direct, no nonsense. Those words fit the character of Tom Hennessy, a veteran reporter and columnist for the Long Beach Press-Telegram, with the solid build of a former prizefighter. He is a newspaperman of the old school, hard-bitten and often cynical, a figure who seems to have stepped from the pages of Damon Runyon. Hennessy brought his notebook and skepticism aboard the Queen Mary one night several years ago to check out the oft-repeated tales of ghostly sightings. He went away not entirely convinced that there wasn't something to them. I had been hearing these ghost stories, and most of them seemed to be connected, with locales on the ship where people had died or had come to some violent end, Hennessy explained. So I had arranged to be locked up in 2 of these places, the swimming pool area and then what's known as Shaft Alley. The reporter spent about a half hour alone in each place in the middle of the night. Guards had locked all the doors and activated the electric alarms to prevent anyone else from entering. His vigil near the swimming pool proved uneventful. He found a dressing room light blazing, but that he attributes to a forgetful tour guide or bad wiring. Shaft Alley proved to be a different story. Hennessy doesn't completely accept the notion that what happened to him there proves the Queen is haunted, but it left him with some lingering questions. I started along the catwalk in Shaft Alley, and I passed an oil drum. I walked down to the end, and I came back, and there were 2 oil drums there. I said to myself, no, there must have been 2 at the very beginning, except I didn't know that was for sure. I wondered about that. The other thing that happened was that I heard very distinctly a voice, and I was able to make out a few words, something like, close the door. Later on there was a noise which seemed to be almost like a voice, except as I would approach it, it would die away. Then as I would leave, I would hear it again. But at one point, I distinctly heard words. I told this to the guard later on. I said it must have been a voice coming through the ventilation system, and he told me we were 2 decks away from where anyone was. He also said not to worry. I wasn't the first person who had heard this sort of thing. Hennessy is still a skeptic about ghosts and moving oil drums, allowing himself to say only that his investigation of the Queen Mary was an interesting experience. He continues to be intrigued by the stories and admits some of them are really tough to explain. Veteran Queen Mary security officer Billy Thompson echoes those who can't explain the phenomena. The pool is an amazing place because all of those doors around it are on the alarm. Anybody that sets foot through those doors triggers the sensors. The alarms would go off at night, we'd go in there, and there was no one. We even staked it out to see if maybe somebody's down there trying to steal something. Thompson and the other guards would hide in the old dressing rooms or showers, hoping to catch the culprits. They never did, and if one is to believe the accounts, probably couldn't if they tried. So far as it is known, a ghost has never been captured. All of a sudden, alarms would go off, Thompson said of his late-night hunting expeditions, and yet nobody's there. We saw water on the floor by the pool where it was dry before, and the water's moving. At other times, Thompson would edge even closer to the pool so that all he had to do was look around a corner to get a clear view of anyone swimming. Then he would hear a splash, as if someone had jumped in the water. He quickly thrust his head out, and although the water was roiling, the pool was empty. You figure that one out, Thomas challenged. Inexplicable activity is not limited to the Queen Mary's first-class swimming pool, shaft alley, escalators, or bath. Nor does it appear that the hauntings are always deliberate, occurring numerous times in a single place. Sometimes the acts are random, more indicative of traditional poltergeist activity. Ellie Mae is a waitress of long standing aboard the Queen. She has worked over the years in all of the ship hotel's dining areas, including the elegant main dining salon where sumptuous Sunday brunches are a Long Beach tradition, and the Pig and Whistle, a quaint tavern modeled after an old English pub. I've seen plates fly clear across the room and break all to pieces for no reason, Ellie Mae said. They landed right in the middle of the floor. The early morning hours before the restaurant opened to customers were the times when she witnessed most of these events. There was me and a gal named Peggy. She's not here anymore, and she was standing right by the steam table. I thought that poor child was going to faint right there. I was talking to her, and it just lifted them up and threw them like a frisbee. About 3 of them, just a few seconds apart, from the steam table to the middle of the room, about 10 feet. In late spring 1989, Ellie Mae had a second encounter with poltergeist activity. Shortly after she arrived for work at 5 o'clock in the morning, Ellie Mae heard the scream of a waitress in a workroom near the Pig and Whistle. Somebody tried to pick up the table where she was sitting, Ellie Mae said. It just started shaking, and she screamed at the top of her lungs. She was scared to death. I came in and found the pictures on the wall upside down, the clock hanging upside down by the front door. I just put them back, but the chef told me I should have had a camera so I could tell security about it. Ellie Mae finds it impossible to believe that the other waitress or someone unknown could have caused either bit of mischief. She was usually at work a few minutes before 5, preparing for the day's customers alone or with another early arriving waitress. It would be extremely difficult for an intruder to get in without Ellie Mae's knowledge. Sean Duke is a former guide who did quite a bit of exploring on the old passenger liner to satisfy his interest in its intriguing history. He found one section that caused him to listen more attentively to the tales told by other employees. That was up in the bow of the ship, just behind the bosun's locker, Duke said. He visited that room frequently, but never experienced what he felt on one particular day. It was cold, meat locker cold. It was a hot day, and ship's hulls are not air-conditioned. They get very hot in the summer. I didn't stay that day. I went in and came right back out. Duke described that part of the ship as a working area for crew members. It's off-limit to visitors and normally locked. The sudden cold struck Duke as being more odd than frightening. But he still can't explain what could have caused such a plunge in temperature inside the hull of an enormous ship on a simmering summer day. Among the entertainments for days visitors and overnight guests aboard the Queen Mary Hotel are tours of various parts of the ship. Brave souls can venture through haunted Shaft Alley and the nearby first-class swimming pool, where they might wish to view a furnished luxury suite as it was decorated in the 1930s. On either tour, cheerful guides explain the intricacies of life among well-to-do travelers of a half-century ago. What they may not explain is the case of the disembodied voice Nancy Wozni heard as a chief guide some years ago. On this day, it was Wozni's assignment to trail each tour group, shutting doors and turning off lights in the suite exhibit as the last of the tourists passed her way, in order to prevent anyone from getting lost, or, even worse, vandalizing the exhibit. Nancy Wozni was listening to the tour guide explain the luxuries of first-class passage when she was startled out of her reverie. I thought it was a joke being played on me, Wozni said. I was in the suite exhibits. The tour guides were on one side of the wall to the area, and they were to bring the group around past me. I was going to go ahead and lock the front doors after them. I was listening to her talk about the suite exhibit. I had my clipboard in my hand, and I leaned against the wall. Just as I touched it came, "No!" The hair stood up on the back of my neck, but I thought it was my supervisor who'd crept up behind me and was trying to scare me. I reeled around to hit him, and he wasn't there. In fact, no one was there who could have uttered that single clear, frightening word. No! The voice came from directly behind her at the instant she touched the woodwork. The voice sounded human because I thought it was my supervisor, Wozni remembered. A wall phone nearby proved that it wasn't her boss. I ran to the phone and I called him, and he answered it. That would have been 5 decks down and 1,000 feet away, she estimates. Nancy Wozni filed that incident away until a friend of hers, now deceased, had a strange experience in the same suite exhibit area. Wozni explained that her friend was standing near a 3-way mirror on hinged doors that opened into a small room. Suddenly, the doors started to rattle and then flew open. 2 beams of light, like a pair of headlamps, bounced around and down in the dim closet-like room. She was hysterical when it happened, Wozni said. Once she got the woman calmed down, Wozni said they began comparing notes and realized that they had both encountered these unknown forces in approximately the same place in the suite's exhibits. That's when they started telling other employees of their experiences. I'm not spiritual. I don't necessarily believe in these things. But I know what I saw, and I can't explain it, Wozni said. She definitely believes the frightening story, told by 2 other guides who came to her in tears one afternoon. Both had been on the engine room platform in Shaft Alley when they distinctly heard a man clearing his throat, as if he wanted to call attention to himself. Only they couldn't see anyone else to pay attention to. When a chain hanging from a ceiling pipe started to arc through the air, the pair fled. They both saw it and were both hysterical. They wouldn't go near the area again, Wozni said. It scared them to death. The engine room is near the watertight door where legend has it Queen Mary crewman John Peter was crushed to death. Coincidence? Or the desperate attempt by his trapped spirit to make contact with the world of the flesh? The HMS Queen Mary, along with Howard Hughes's nearby wooden airplane, the Spruce Goose, which flew only once for a short distance, enjoyed a popularity on the Long Beach waterfront equaled by only a few other Southern California attractions. Each year, thousands of tourists queued up to tour the Grande Dame of the seas, spend a night or weekend luxuriating in one of the exquisitely decorated stateroom suites in the Queen Mary Hotel, or partake of a sumptuous Sunday brunch in the elegant first-class dining room. Her engines have long since been removed and permanent gangplanks and cables anchor the ship tightly to a visitor center, but the Queen Mary still exudes a majesty, an almost palpable sensation of power and repose. A visitor need not even shut his eyes to imagine the gleaming black and red hull, splitting the turbulent white caps as the ship raced across the ocean. Heavy black smoke pouring from her triple smokestacks as she tried to outrace the inexorable passage of an era. The ghostly crewman on the escalator, a bather who refuses to leave the pool, echoing voices of doomed sailors, and all the other peculiar phenomena are also a part of the Queen Mary's captivating legacy. And so it should be that a ship which touched so many lives should harbor secrets beyond the ken of mere mortals. And there's a postscript. Press accounts in mid-1992 asserted that the Queen Mary might be out of business by the end of the year, unless a new buyer could be found for the luxury liner. Although the city of Long Beach paid over $400 million to purchase and restore the ship nearly 3 decades ago, it has been a money loser ever since, despite being the city's #1 tourist attraction. The Walt Disney Corporation reportedly lost $7 million annually after taking over the ship's management in 1988. Disney had offered to continue operating the restaurants and shipboard leisure facilities until a new buyer, if any, could be found. The hotel closed on October 1st, 1992. On December 22, 1992, the Long Beach City Council voted to take over the Queen Mary from the Independent Harbor Commission, which had wanted to sell the ship to a group of Hong Kong investors. A non-profit corporation was formed in January 1993 to operate what is now the Queen Mary Seaport, a 55-acre park which includes the ship, a British-themed shopping center, and a children's playground. While Disney had charged almost $18 to tour the ship, and the adjacent Spruce Goose, now moved to an Oregon Aviation Museum, admission to visit the ship and its numerous exhibits is now free. The city hopes to make up for the lost gate revenue through income generated by the Queen's restaurant, bars, and hotel, which have all reopened. The Grand Old Lady of the High Seas and her ghosts seem to have cheated oblivion once again. And that is it for that story. There is another California one, but I think this is long enough. We're at about 35 minutes. The Paint With Me, or I'm sorry, if you want to call it that, the Stitch With Me that I did earlier is about an hour. But I have been to the Queen Mary. It is cool. I want to stay there. I'm hoping for our anniversary in August, which would be awesome. there's a lot more stories I've heard that are related to it. But the only time I went to the Queen Mary, it was Christmas, and so in that park area that they were talking about, they had a whole like winter carnival thing going on, which was pretty cool. And so the only thing we did on the ship was basically just tour it. They do some really cool, like, line some of the decks with Christmas trees, and like you can go in the old, what do they call it? Like wheelhouse and stuff, or not wheelhouse, like where they steer the ship. Totally blanking on what it's called. Like you can go and see all the old mechanics and things like that. And I think there's a video of it. I don't remember, but I do want to do a ghost tour because we didn't get to do any tours or anything like that while we were there. So that's going to be my hopeful goal coming up. Every Halloween they do a haunted house inside, but I don't do those, which you guys know if you've watched my videos for a while, so I won't be going for Halloween. So our anniversary is in August, like beginning of August, so that's before they do anything to it. It's less than a month now that I think about it. But yeah, that's all I have for you today. I will not always be reading out of this book for the Stitch With Me's. I might find like the Amityville Horror House or something, some of those cool places, and just find different stories and stuff from online to tell you guys about them. So I hope you all enjoyed this. If you did, or if you have different ideas, let me know in the comments below. Please like and subscribe, and I will see you all next time.